The speakers are going to be Mark Pullen, Sid Karin, Richard Mandelbaum, myself, Doug Gale, Glenn Ricart, Jim Williams, and Henry Shaffer. Now, just a little bit of background. Mark was the person who shut down the ARPANET. Sid Karin was a person who started the San Diego Supercomputing Center. Richard Mandelbaum, myself, and Glenn Ricart, we started the first 3 of the regional networks on the NSFNET. Jim Williams was one of the folks that oversaw the growth of the mid-level networks and creating something called FARNet. And Henry Shaffer was heavily involved in an activity of all of the mid-level networks, which was an almost commercial activity called the CORIN. And so we're going to be addressing those topics. We've heard a lot about the backbone, but I'm going to replay this slide again. The NSFNet and the internet was a lot more than just a backbone. You'll recall that the T1 backbone connected 13 nodes. Well, where were those millions of people connected? Well, they were connected to campus networks, they were connected to regional networks, they were connected to new spin-off networks. In short, they were connected to other folks. And so that's going to be the subject of this panel. The way we've organized things is we have 7 speakers. They're each going to speak for 4 minutes. The timekeeper will hold up 1 minute when they have 1 minute left out of their allocated 4. If they run over 4, we have a sniper in the audience who has agreed to shoot them. So we'll have 28 minutes there. Then we're going to open it up for discussion, and at the very end, and the discussion will be questions that the chair, the moderator, that's me, is going to be asking them. We had some questions that we'd agreed on beforehand, but the previous panel asked most of those. So I've been trying to make up some new ones. So panelists, I'm sorry, you don't know what these are. And then we're going to leave the last 10 minutes for questions from the audience. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to our first speaker, Mark.
Okay. Is it working? If you think that you're going to scare me with a threat of a sniper from the audience, Mark, when I was the guy who...
Come up here so you can advance yourself.
Okay. All right. I'll do that. Yeah, if you think you're going to scare me with a threat of a sniper from the audience when I shut down DOD's crown jewels network, the ARPANET, you can think again, okay? But I think I can stay under 4 minutes all the same because I have a very short story to tell. It's a good story, though. I don't particularly like being thought of as the purveyor of something negative, shutting down the ARPANET, but actually, I think it enabled something very, very positive, namely the growth of the NSFNET. For those who somehow managed to miss this piece of history, ARPANET was the first large-scale packet network, and as such, it provided an existence proof that packet networking has dramatic advantages. So one of the roles of DARPA always is to investigate new leading-edge technologies, and it did that. That was not on my watch. There were a bunch of very smart people. One can speak of Larry Roberts or Bob Kahn or Vince Cerf that undertook these activities. But one of the things that happened with ARPANET, it started out as a test bed, but over the years it came to support DARPA's contractor community. And they are absolutely a world-class group of academic and industry researchers. So you can see what a great opportunity it was for me to be at DARPA, because I work with all those people, and then I work with the likes of Vint and Bob. So that's really superb. Now, as ARPANET moved past being the first existence proof for packet networking, it became the core of the existence proof for internetworking. And that story has been told many times elsewhere. I won't tell it again, but we all know that it was a tremendous achievement. I showed that a scalable network of networks is a feasible thing, and we've all seen where that went. It deployed and validated the TCP/IP protocol in pretty close to the form that it's still used today. It's had some, the TCP parts had some tweaks, but it did some wonderful things, and there had to be networks to interconnect, so it interconnected DoD's military network, MILNET, unclassified network, and NASA and DOE had scientific computing networks that were also interconnected. So putting NSFNET into this mix, in some sense, had created a tremendous opportunity, because not only were we showing what a great thing internetworking was, but we were getting the early adopter universities connected and really sort of creating that primordial goo that commercial internetworking would grow out of. And the term is used advisedly. But ARPANET itself was really a victim of its own success, because as it came to be viewed as infrastructure for the DARPA contractor community, it was less and less useful as a test bed, because infrastructure needs stability, and in fact it would have lost its reputation as a useful thing if it had been less stable. Not only that, it was costing a lot of money. In fact, it was really basically costing the whole networking research budget, which, if I recall right, at the time it was about $14 million a year. So I took over management of the networking program. I'd been managing parallel computing, and I stayed with that for a while in parallel, but I ultimately moved more and more into the networking area. And taking a look at this ARPANET thing, there was a real quandary, because here we had this wonderful thing that DoD had created that was in heavy use and was enabling a community to do important things, and yet DARPA, we thought the premier place for networking research, wasn't able to do much research because of it. So what do you do? And well, I was a brash young Army officer at the time. I'm a brash old professor now, but the decision I made was it's time to shut down the ARPANET, and that had to be handled quite delicately. I do remember calling the president of Texas Instruments at the time, George Heilmeyer, who was a previous director of DARPA, and telling him he was about to lose his internet support. And but we transitioned the sites to the NSFNET regional networks, and they in turn, as we all know, seeded the commercial internet. And the result, from my perspective, brought much success. DARPA got its research budget back. I had some great experience and visibility. Yeah. Having the premier research players in the NSFNET helped stimulate its growth, and DARPA, NSF, NASA, DOE really found common cause in encouraging growth of the internet. We formed a thing called the Federal Research Internet Coordinating Committee, which lasted a few years until it got bigger, and took a certain amount of flack over creating a thing called the FRIC, but it worked, and we did good things. And among the other things we achieved was that DARPA had internet sites already in Europe, in the defense community, and that sort of was a foothold there. That, and of course the DoD MILNET that was worldwide, that encouraged early growth of the worldwide internet. And I'm seeing I'm out of time, and it's time to sit down. Thanks.
I won't read the slides to you, since I'm sure everybody here can read. Just a couple of anecdotes. NSFNET came out of a conference which was organized by Ken King, Bill Schrader, a name which isn't familiar, Bob McCrory, who was the head of the University of Rochester Laser Fusion Lab, myself, and it started a cooperation between academe, government, and industry. And one of the first things we did was work very closely to try to get New York State support for this. And John Marburger spoke this morning. He didn't mention his crucial role. He was the person whom the state of New York turned to try to analyze, was a network good for the state or wasn't it good for the state? And when he said, oh, this was going to be very, very good, which he did, that was probably the decisive reason why the state decided that they would fund the network. The interesting anecdote that I have about state funding is they didn't understand what they were doing, but they knew that they were getting credit. So I think in the second or third year of funding, the state of New York mounted a campaign where they put full-page ads in just about every newspaper in New York State talking about their support for networking and NSFNET, and we figured out that they spent more that year on ads than they spent on supporting the network. The network went up very, very quickly. We wrote an NSF proposal in '85. We got support in '86. The network went live as a T1 network in '87, and by the third quarter, all 15 founding institutions were live. I remember at a presentation we tried to make to the governor in '88, I did a little bit of history, and I found out that this was actually the second digital network in the history of New York. Dan Van Bellingham reminded me that I mentioned at that time that in 1825, when the Erie Canal was opened, they set up cannons every 5 miles along the length of the canal from Buffalo to Albany and then down the Hudson River to New York. And when the ribbon was cut, they fired a blast, and this propagated down to New York and then back up to Albany, and that was probably the first digital signal transmitted in New York State. It underlined some of the problems we would always have in networking in terms of asymmetry. It took 2 hours and 40 minutes for the signal to go from Buffalo to New York and 1 hour and 35 minutes to return. So those problems we still have. Another anecdote, we managed in the early years to get NITEL and Rochester Telephone to invest many, many millions of dollars into building this network, much, much more than the sum total of the university investment, the state investment, NSF's investment, et cetera, et cetera. But in 1988, NITEL decided they had enough, and Bill Schrader, I can't see because of the lights, but he and I had a meeting with one of the most senior of the multitudinous vice presidents of New York Tel, who looked at us and said, we've learned a lot, it was an interesting experiment, but clearly the future of networking is X.25. I think also NSFNET should take a little bit of credit, though the real credit belongs to the individuals, for starting the commercial ball rolling. 3 of the initial commercial providers all were done by NSFNET founders. I mean, Bill decided to build one of the first for-profit ISPs, maybe the first. I mean, Rick Adams and he can fight about that if they'd like to. Provider PSI, which I think certainly is the first commercial ISP. Al, a year later, built, or was the core of the building of ANS, and a few years later, I built Applied Theory, and those were all projects which were started by the people who founded NSFNET. Some quick lessons. I think the lessons were, for me, the very interesting interrelationship between technology, policy, politics, and all of those things. Very often, technical decisions precipitate all kinds of political situations, and on the other hand, policy decisions lead to all kinds of technical and political problems. NSFNET pioneered, we wrote the first network AUP, acceptable use policy, and I think, again, Al Weiss and Ken King authored it. we were pioneers in the invention of some of the network technology which allowed us to manage this. I mean, SNMP was an ISONET product. It was initially called SGMP. Marty Schaffstall was one of the key authors. And we actually anticipated a bit of doing things on a commercial level because we went out and we actually sold the first commercial license to SNMP, Marty, Bill, and I, and we sold that back in 1988 or something like that. So that's a bit of the history of one of the mid-levels. Thank you.
So I want to say thanks to the organizers for inviting me here because I'm not really a networking guy. If I ever had any expertise in anything, no one would say it was networking. But I have been involved around the periphery for quite some time, and I learned a lot today that I thought I knew or thought I didn't know. A lot of it I think is true also, but maybe not quite all of it. Before I talk about what went on in the supercomputing centers, I do want to make one statement, though, about the two people who really made this all happen, Dennis Jennings and Steve Wolf. And I don't think anybody else made contributions even remotely comparable to theirs. And that's not to denigrate all the people who worked 24/7 and solved incredibly difficult technical problems, bureaucratic problems, corporate problems, and so on. But those guys had a role not just as government bureaucrats, but technical people with a vision, and they were swimming upstream. There's no question about it. It was not very well received. To this day, I try to explain to some of my very distinguished computer science faculty colleagues about what Steve did in particular, and I get pushback on it. And so I want to say thanks to Dennis and Steve who really made this happen. So the best way I can describe what we did in San Diego is to describe my own history with all of this stuff. So I also have a Michigan connection. I was a graduate student at Michigan in the 60s and very early 70s in nuclear engineering. And what I learned there, I also have a CCNY connection where I was an undergraduate. Didn't know all the key people in computing at CCNY or at Michigan. But at CCNY, we did something called batch computing. Some of you are old enough to remember that. And when I got to Michigan, I discovered something called interactive computing, which seemed like a big step forward. Now, the Michigan people would probably think that was MTS. But in fact, in the nuclear engineering department, we had a teletype connection to a Philco machine at the Ford Scientific Lab that we had free access to as graduate students that predated MTS. But then we got involved with MTS, and I actually used MTS remotely because several faculty and a few of us graduate students formed what is now called a startup. We didn't have that phrase back then, that did computational simulation for reactors, and we went around various places and ran our simulations on the MTS system at Michigan from places like Chicago and Virginia and so on, using dial-up access. But I got started with remote access and interactive computing, and that's all I knew. I went into industry at General Atomic, and after not very long time, got involved with the very beginnings of what was first called the CTRCC network, then Bellarized into the MFE-CC network and MFENet. I contributed Epsilon to the development of that network in that Jim Layton, who's not here, was developing the hardware, and Barry Howard, who's not here, was developing the software, and that network had remote login and differential class of service and file transfer and email and all that in 1975. And while Barry was developing that software, and Barry's group we were the only major node in the same time zone. And so my role was to hold a telephone in one hand and flip switches on a PDP-11 with the other hand and tell Barry what lights lit up. Not a very intellectual contribution, but I do claim some contribution to that development. That led to my eventually proposing the San Diego Supercomputer Center as an unsolicited proposal about the same time that Larry Smarr also sent an unsolicited proposal to the Science Foundation to establish a center. And my experience had been with Livermore and the MFE Center, which was interactive. Larry's was by going to Livermore and using the LCC system, and guess what? He proposed a system like that. I proposed a system like the one I was used to. A lot of things happened, and eventually we got funded. And one of the things that happened was we proposed a network, and so within the Office of Advanced Scientific Computing, a network was funded. And despite being the evil supercomputer guy that Dennis was sort of referring to earlier, the slot that Dennis came and took was there because we had been funded to do a network. You can imagine that when Dennis then proposed that we do something different in that network, we were a little resistant since we'd been funded to do something else. And we had several thousand faculty and graduate students, production users of our facility, and we resisted. And we resisted in the same sense that Dennis described resisting the other standard protocols. I said, we'll run TCP/IP when it works, and we did. And in consonance with the saying that some of you will recognize about boats and airplanes, that the two happiest days you have are the day you buy it and the day you sell it. I think my major contributions here were to start the SDSC network and then to shut it down when the NSFNET was actually ready for prime time activities, and we did that. One other note that I wanted to make, though, about the commercial things, I know about swimming upstream at NSF because when we started SDSC, it was General Atomic Corporation that was the formal grantee, and we were a profit center at GA, and SDSCNet became SurfNet as a profit center and was born as a commercial entity initially, not to take anything away from what the NISANET people did, which was very impressive, but there were things like that going on initially, and I could speak for a long time, and won't now, about how you deal with NSF when you're not a university. Thank you.
I'm going to change hats for just a moment, and also we've got the order back straight again. One of the things that happens with advancing age is as your hair turns white, it drains the stuff out of your neurons, and you tend to get things out of order, so I apologize. I'm not going to go through these slides in detail, but what I'd like to do is to kind of look back in time and think about what we were thinking about at various points in time. Excuse me. What were we thinking about in 1985? And I've lifted a slide from a presentation that we did at MidNet in 1985. We were thinking about supercomputing center access, because that was one of the big drivers. How do we access the supercomputing centers? Both the Phase 1 centers, you remember there was a string of those, Boeing and a number of others, and the new Phase 2 centers that the National Science Foundation was funding. We were talking about ARPANET. It was still a big deal. Some of us were still making connections to ARPANET. We were talking about USAN, a satellite network running out of Boulder, Colorado. BitNet was big news on our campus. There was this new thing called the NSFNET that we were hearing about, and around the country people were talking about forming regional networks. So we had our first meeting in the Midwest in 1985, and we sent in an unsolicited proposal to the National Science Foundation. What were we talking about in 1986? Well, the NSF had funded some of those regional networks. The first three were MidNet, SuraNet, and NISRNet, all of whom had submitted unsolicited proposals the year before. We were very quickly followed by BARNet, SesquiNet, and Marriott. So what you see is a map taken from a meeting in 1986 showing the regional networks around the country. the interesting thing is, you notice I listed all of the campuses that were connected, and they fit on one view graph. Okay. The other thing I had was a map. Now, let's be honest. In 1986, our network was a bunch of lines on maps. It didn't work. Heck, we didn't even have most of the lines in. We were selling smoke and mirrors. All right, now we're into 1987. The T1 backbone solicitation was out. The original regional networks were actually becoming operational. We had some lines in place. They were actually running. Expansion was occurring all over the place. You'll notice other networks were forming, WestNet, NorthwestNet, Marriott. Well, Marriott had already been there, sorry. But networks were forming all over the country. The T1 backbone was going to go live at the end of the year. And with the 56K backbone, I'm sorry, not the T1 backbone, with the 56K backbone, it actually worked, you know, for about 2 weeks before it was overloaded. What were we talking about in 1988? All right. Now we were talking about how great it was. The T1 backbone was in, it worked, our users were happy. For a change, we weren't used car salesmen. We actually could demonstrate the NSFNET. And then, of course, most of us were CIOs, and we started thinking about, and how much is it going to cost us? The slides here were taken from a talk I gave at the SIGUX conference, University, Special Interest Group for University and College Computing Centers, okay, SIGUX. And at that meeting, I had a chart where I outlined various costs at various funding levels. They're summarized on the bottom left. And I told the folks in the audience that, you know, when we stop getting all the subsidies, a T1 connection is probably going to cost us about $30,000 a year. I knew there was a problem when I noticed in one side of the room they were piling up a bunch of towels and collecting the water pitchers. On the other side of the room, they were tearing the tablecloths apart and weaving them into rope. And I was told in no uncertain terms by the CIOs in the room that $30,000 a year was outrageous. No one could possibly afford that, even a big research university. Well, by 1993, we had a T3 backbone. We had over 1.4 million attached computers, 10 to 15 million users. We were reaching 100 nations. Interestingly enough, the basic services were still an interactive login, file transfer, and electronic mail. Regional T1 connectivity was becoming fairly common. There were leaders like NSFNET that had already put in T1 infrastructures. The regionals were incorporating as either 501c3s or nonprofits. Almost 100 institutions were connected in MidNet. We were looking for for-profit members, alternative backbone connections. What was the network being used for? Mike Stamen likes to tell the story about the immense amount of traffic that came out of CICnet because of their, what he called the brown paper bag, which was a series of library resources that were just dumped in a resource. Well, you'll notice CICnet is the third bar chart there. MidNet at this point was the largest source of internet traffic in the world, coming out of Lincoln, Nebraska. What in the world were people doing? Talking to folks that grow corn? No, it was WU Archives at Washington University in St. Louis. How many of you remember WU Archives? That's where everybody stored their jokes, their computer programs, and all the other miscellaneous stuff that didn't fit anywhere else. So that was the big use of the internet in 1993.
So really, Doug, you were the first Google, if I can get that correctly? WU Archives there. Hi, I'm Glenn Ricart, and it's fantastic to see so many friends and old acquaintances and enemies out in the audience. And by the way, if you were an enemy, you're not anymore. The statute of limitations has passed, and you're now into friend status regardless of what happened during that time period. So I want to tell you a little bit about SURNet, but I also want to tell you a little bit about a story. You know, the NSFNet has at least 1,000 stories, maybe 10,000 stories, because it wasn't any 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 or 100 or even 200 people here. It was more like 1,000 or maybe up to 10,000 people. So I just want to tell you one story of that. That would be the story that I have to tell about that. And I want to tell you the backstory of SuraNet a little bit from my point of view. And there's other backstories of SuraNet too. So my backstory begins in February 1982. And what happens is I am the new academic CIO at the University of Maryland. And I have a problem. My problem is I am master of all I survey, which turns out to be a mainframe. All the real computing on campus is being done in these departmental mini computers, which of course they're taking care of themselves, and I'm not providing or helping with at all. So what to do about this? Well, the solution was actually suggested by the person whose picture you see here, Walt Gilbert. He was my assistant director at the time, and he said, you know, we really need a campus network. That's the right thing to go do. And I wish I could say that I was so prescient to know that TCP/IP was exactly the right protocol, and I was a brave visionary to go do that. But as a matter of practicality, the OSI stack wasn't really ready to go at that time and wasn't really a choice. And I had DEC computers and IBM computers, and so I couldn't pick either one of those individual programming, individual languages for networking. I had to pick something that would work across, and TCP/IP was basically the only choice. So it was a pragmatic choice to go and put the campus on TCP/IP networking. So hold that thought, and now I'm going to go and transition just a bit. And there's this organization called SURA, the Southeastern Universities Research Association. SURA is an organization of 17 states in the Southeast, and they had gotten a supercomputer. I'm sorry, they had gotten an accelerator. They were physicists, basically, who had gotten an accelerator. At that time, it was called CBAF, the Continuous Electron Beam Accelerator Facility, now called JLab. And they said, let's form a computer committee and get a supercomputer for the Southeast. If we don't, we know it's going to go to those folks in the Northeast and the West. We need the supercomputer here in the Southeast. So there was a meeting in October of 1983, and the job was to get behind a single proposal for a supercomputer for the Southeast. And everyone agreed, yep, we're all going to get the supercomputer in the Southeast. There's going to be one proposal. All of us will back it. We'll get the supercomputer in the Southeast. There's only one little problem. We couldn't quite agree on where that supercomputer would be located. There are many fine institutions in the Southeast who would be deserving of a supercomputer. So the meeting was about to fall apart when the person whose picture you see here, Jess Poor, said, well, you know, we could all get behind a network to whatever supercomputer appears, which at that time they thought would probably be in the Southeast. But there were two people that were sort of charged to go forward and make that happen, Glenn Ricart and Henry Shaffer over there. So we were to go off, and the name SuraNet got created in October of '83. The next salient date here I wanted to mention was June 3rd, 1984. And being the one who was local here to the area, the University of Maryland, I made an informal proposal for SuraNet to the NSF Networking Subcommittee of the NSF Advisory Committee for Advanced Scientific Computing. I came out and I wrote a kind of down letter to the president of SURA saying, I don't think they're going to be interested in SuraNet. They want this national science net thing, and we can only offer them a regional network. So of course the solution was to have some kind of a 3- or 4-tier networking structure. We met with Harris Communications on June 22nd, proposing a satellite network because we couldn't get 56 kilobits everywhere. And on March 12, 1985, we submitted a plan and experiment for demonstration supercomputer network. That was an unsolicited proposal, and asked Dennis Jennings on how he decided to go handle that. It was just a difficult thing. I was here local, so I could come down and bug them regularly, which was a great advantage. And it was eventually superseded by the NSFNET solicitation. Here are 3 key people involved. Hopefully you recognize the one on the left. There's the middle one, and the one on the right is Morton Tarragon from George Washington University. This is the network that was proposed in 1986 at first state-to-state network. And we became the first NSFNet regional to establish operations. Jack Hahn, who was the initial management operator, is right here someplace. Where are you, Jack? Thank you very much. And I see that I'm out of time. That was one of the stories from the NSFNet.
If this comes up and says Henry, you know, we'll make a little switch here. Thank you, sir. Well, contrary to belief in the earlier introduction, I didn't actually invent anything. Al Gore did some of that, and the regionals were invented by others. I came along a little bit later and adapted some of the good ideas of others. When Doug said, you know, put together some PowerPoint presentations, I said, hell, I can use foils. So I dug through my barn and I found some old foils that we used a while ago. This says, what's the date on there, 99. This is large, or 94. This was used to present sort of our story to some other folks, but I thought it sort of captured what we did. Here's what here's a schematic, a way of looking at what this architecture was and where these mid-level networks fit in. And so I came along after this first wave of folks had built some regional networks, and so this was my experience with building a regional network. Now, I was in Nevada, state of Nevada, and I think I was the only guy in the state of Nevada that knew the term TCP/IP. And here's kind of the sequence: is one, you've got to believe in the TCP/IP gospel, okay? And truly, it was a transformative technology if you looked at it and you thought about it. All we had to talk about mostly were, you know, slideshows, but it looked to be like a good thing. You got to act like you know what you're doing. And then you get to know Jane Cavanis. We kind of came to know Jane as mom and Steve as dad, and then put together some sort of network. What we had designed in Nevada was something based upon microwave because we couldn't possibly get circuits between across our desert in Nevada. So we put together some proposal on. Based upon microwave, and in fact, before that came off, I ran across a guy named Jay Crookston, who's also here, and he said, you know, maybe we could get you something by running it through California, but we would only charge you, and so that would work. So you had to put together some sort of network. The other thing was that you needed to join FARNet, and to do that, at the time, you needed to go to 3 meetings, and you had to kick in $1,000, and then you could sit around the table with guys like with Mandelbaum here and get his ideas on how to do that, and Glenn and Jack Hahn and a number of other people that are in the room, and you could figure out, you know, how to do that. And then you get Karin Robichek at BBN to put your dot on her map. That to me seemed to be the authoritative map at the time, and get to know Jane Cavanis better. That was the final bullet. However, like any good parent, about that time, you know, Jane said, well, it's time for you to grow up. And so we needed to become self-sufficient. Let's go forward a little bit. Here's kind of a top-down view of who FARNet was and who it was founded in '86 by the leaders of state and regional computing networks that were linked together specifically to the NSFNET. It was a not-for-profit organization, had a mission statement which looked something like this. Here were the members. And you'll notice that even then there were a number of private sector members that were part of this adventure, as well as, of course, all of the regional networks. Wow, here's a slide from somewhere along the line that actually starts to talk about the phasing out. It says, you know, for example, the second bullet, adjust to a diminished direct NSF funding. This, you know, the entitlement was going to go away. These things needed to be become self-funding. I note also evaluate and respond to the VC frenzy, and Here's an overview of some of the changes that we made. Our view: by design, no one is in charge. Oh, here's a picture that Doug shared with me. I believe it's been modified by NSA, and that's what the little numbers are on there. This was a FARNet assembly in 1991 in Las Vegas, Nevada. I see a number of these numbers are here in this room. And this is maybe a testimony to what I would call to that three-level architecture. Here's a quilt meeting in 2007, which you can almost think of as being the successor to FARNet. And so these are representatives. Notice it's about the same number of folks, and it still endures. Now, I've got a couple other things I want to share with you. Don't call me at that address, by the way. I moved many years ago. One, I found a bunch of these out in my barn. My barn happens to be the repository for a bunch of old FARNet stuff, and it's 51 reasons on how we use the information superhighway. It was published in 1992. And for example, there's a really nice little quote in here from California by Tracy LeQuay Parker, who is another honorable Texan that sits over here. And it says, and I'll just cut to the chase, it says, today, our market value is over $6.8 billion, and our yearly sales exceed $640 million. Remember now that there were a number of questions about whether or not this was an appropriate government investment. And then the final line says, and in taxes alone, we've already paid back the United States government's initial investment in the network infrastructure. Wow. That was 1992. One other thing to leave you with, and I don't have a slide on this because I didn't actually think of it until someone mentioned the Cape, and it reminded me of a parable that I think is kind of appropriate and in keeping with maybe a way of looking at what we do. And of course, it's by a famous Texas poet named Guy Clark. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'm going to get at the top and get to the bottom. And the title of this work is called The Cape. 8 years old with flour sack cape tied all around his neck, he climbed up on the garage, figuring, what the heck. He screwed his courage up so tight, the whole thing came unwound. He got a running start, and bless his heart, he headed for the ground. So this story is about a guy that goes on through life, and he climbs up to the top of the garage and tries to fly with a cape. Dave Farber, I think, had mentioned a cape earlier on in the day. And then the chorus goes on, and this is what I think is kind of the piece that kind of defines how some of us thought. It says, spread your arms and hold your breath, and always trust your cape. Thank you.
Okay, so, well, end of slideshow. That's good. I'm not going to use any slides. What I'd like to do is start out with a couple of concepts from computing and from communication. We've had both of them mentioned. In computing, we have parallelism, lots and lots of different threads. And we've seen so far today a huge number of different aspects, the different regionals and so on. We also have layers, and we talked about communication models, and I think that the layers include things like the NSFNET backbone is a layer, the regionals are another layer, and I'll continue with that theme. But you multiply the two together, and what you do is get a huge community. I'm not going to review all of it. We've been sitting here, lots of people have reviewed it from their own points of view, and I'm sort of sitting and listening and wondering, how much do I remember, who do I recognize, and hearing things where I think we all have selective memories. I've heard a lot of people from IBM talking about IBM's adventures in networking, and I never once heard anyone mention Ms. Ellen. Not at all. Yes. talking about TCP/IP versus the competitor, OSI. I'll mention in a minute my activities with libraries. Boy, was that a terrible fight with the academic libraries following the lead of the Library of Congress. That was a really hard fight. And we had an elephant up here earlier, and I don't think we were the blind men studying the elephant. I think what we were a bunch of scientists trying to study an elephant, each of us with our own microscope. And so I'm going to now narrow my focus to what I was involved in, and that was my part of the community. And it was a community. One aspect of the community were the RFCs. Tried to explain that back in those days to a university president, chancellor, to a corporate executive. Our standards are requests for comment. All we had was tentative standards, rough consensus, and running code. I'm going to look at SURANET. Worked with Glenn in those days, and it was a fabulous experience. SURANET worked with the other regionals. For example, MidNet was mentioned. We worked with a group of regionals trying to commercialize in the COREN effort, and I think we run afoul of if only any one of us had $100 million to act as a VC, it could have worked. But I want to go further down, because SURANET had one point of presence in each of the SURA states. That wasn't much. We met a lot in a central, chose a central location. You saw the picture of Jespur. Well, his president, President Pettit at Georgia Tech, was very hospitable to our efforts, and we gathered there and worked and fussed among ourselves. But the point is that state by state, each state had a network. In my state, it was a combination of what's now called, well, TUC, NCREN, MCNC, North Carolina Educational Computing Service. The effort that went on in the state and in the other states was bigger than SURANET's effort. So you add those together. Going further down, I also worked with the libraries, not just in the SURA area, but nationwide, because they had the content, and got to meet people like Cliff Lynch, who was one of the pioneers of putting content on the internet. It was really a wonderful time. If you go down to what the state networks did and what the campuses did, and then you start accumulating upwards, counting the dollars, counting the people, counting the size of the community, the mass was down at the bottom, and you accumulated, and by the time you came to the NSFNET backbone, perhaps at that point, the top layer, you had an enormous investment, you had an enormous number of people working well together, even if they didn't know each other. And so my story is that of our community, and it is wonderful that we're getting together as a community, Doug. Thank you. I hit some too.
Well, what I'd like to do now is throw some questions out for the panelists. You can grab a mic and respond. And the first question's a little bit of a softball, but I'm going to throw it out anyway. What was the greatest technical challenge that you faced, and how did you overcome it? Richard.
I think we probably all had different challenges. In our case, we had a network which was being built by the phone company, and we had no idea what they were doing, and we had to go out and monitor them, what they were doing, and they complained to us they couldn't do anything without having the right tools, so we had to go out and build tools, and the result of that was that Marty Schaffstall and various people around him at RPI went out, and other places, Tennessee, went out and built the first network protocol to do monitoring on a TCP/IP network, despite the fact that all kinds of competing protocols were being funded, but they built it and it worked, and it became the protocol, and that was SNMP.
I was going to say that the biggest technical challenge was that we had actual users, physicists and people in the business school who wanted to talk to somebody at, say, MidNet or NYSERNet, and you wouldn't necessarily know in the beginning whether the problem was at the campus network or at the state network or at the regional network or at the backbone network or at the other regional network or at the other campus network, and doing trouble and problem isolation to figure out where it was, especially in the days when we didn't have very many tools, was a big challenge. And we're grateful to people like NYSERNet who developed sets of tools that helped with that, and there was some standardization. But that was clearly a big technical challenge.
In our case, when we started, the only example of interactive network access to a supercomputer was what Livermore had done with the MFE network. No one else had done it. And they did it in a proprietary way on proprietary hardware. And when we proposed to sort of clone what they'd done, they weren't about to supply the proprietary hardware, and therefore the proprietary software wasn't any good to us either. And they essentially said, you won't succeed. So I hired the guy that wrote the software.
My experience, largely was both a blessing and a curse and associated with interacting with telephone companies, and I'm talking about my experience in Nevada now. And the blessing was that we got in one hell of a run before they knew what we were doing. The curse was we had to bring it up in that environment. Short story, had a horrible problem with some equipment at one time, and it was a T1 circuit. And we were running TCP/IP on it, of course. We were part of the then emerging internet, and it turned out it was a telco problem, and I was beating so hard on telco that the guy said, no, it's your equipment, and let me replace it I'm just going to replace it. So I came in one morning, and the guy had actually replaced our T1 MUX with a 24 channel bank. I forgot what they were called, assuming that we were going to run voice on it.
It reminds me, dealing with the phone companies, it really doesn't hurt to steal 1 bit out of every 8th byte, does it? That's why you hear about 56 KB connections when they're really 64, except for 1 bit every 8th byte.
Which for voice you don't even notice is missing.
So getting them to think digital instead of voice was really a culture shift.
I guess I'll be the negative voice again. The fact was we had a lot of technical problems, but I don't remember any of them being insurmountable. We had the DARPA stable of people who had invented the internet at our beck and call. The large problems were all political, and that took goodwill on the part of everyone and some great determination too. But that's how we got through.
Well, in MidNet, our biggest technical problem was similar to ones that you've heard, and that was getting our 56K lines. The Midwest is centrally isolated, and we had 11 sites, and 10 of them didn't have 56K assemblies. So there was no 56K service available. It turns out our director of telecommunications, Ruth Mekalecki, some of you may have known Ruth, she was a bit of a dynamo, and she actually obtained the circuits for us. She did it at an ACUDA meeting. She was sitting in a panel much like this with it's either the president or one of the senior vice presidents from AT&T, and she started talking about this wonderful thing called the NSFNET. And then she turned, and I can't remember the individual's name, and she turned to him and said, we'll call him George, George, isn't this a great project, and we're so proud that AT&T is providing the 56K support for this project. And everyone started applauding, and George took the applaud and said, yes, it's a great project. He didn't have any clue as to what the project was, but he was glad to accept the applause. And if you know Ruth, that was the only opening she needed. I mean, that was it. She got the 56K lines after that, even though it required a special assembly in 10 of the 11 sites. Which leads me to the next question, and this one is not going to be expected, I think, by the panelists. I mean, we hear lots of well-engineered solutions that we've done. I'd like to ask, what was the kludgiest solution that you used to solve a problem?
What's a kludge?
What we do most of the time.
So I'll just recall one incident when we first got the network going. We just installed this $15 million supercomputer in a brand new building we just built for $10 million, and we're putting the satellite network together with 56 kilobit lines. And we hadn't delivered anything to anybody yet. And a truck came with this 30-foot diameter C-band antenna and put it face up in the parking lot before they put it on the roof. And as I was leaving the building that day, there were two guys standing on opposite ends, facing each other across the diameter of the dish with sledgehammers. And they were swinging the sledgehammers and pounding on the dish. And I knew that that had to be wrong. but I just couldn't deal with it, so I went home.
I guess I've got two. When we first brought the network into Nevada, we were living in recall that I'd mentioned that I think I was the only guy in the state for a while that knew TCP/IP or knew the word TCP/IP. And so we had it in, and we had it connected to mainframes, and this is pretty much a terminal host kind of environment. But we had an astrophysicist over a couple of buildings away that wanted to use it. And the idea of hooking up his Sun workstation directly to this thing was just, it didn't fit with the campus hierarchy at all. That was not going to work. So he and I went in on a weekend and got some coax and strung it across. The other story is probably a little more interesting, and I'm gonna be as vague as I can, although the statute of limitations is up. But it's not a story about anything I did, but the person that did it is in this room, and it goes essentially like this. There was a time when there were some folks that with a certain organization with which I was associated, were assisting the deployment of some sort of connection into the Soviet Union, except I think it was called the Soviet Union at that time, and but we could not take routers over there. And so a router went, but you could take something in, you could take in a piece of test equipment or whatever, and I'm doing an approximation of truth here, but truth is in this room. So the router went into the Soviet Union, and out came, when it was time to come back, I believe it was an old broken transistor radio or something like that, and they were absolutely convinced, they had no idea what it was that went in or out, right, that it was the same device. The truth is in this room. It may come up later. I have no idea.
It just reminds me of another amusing story. At one point, due to my lack of expertise in networking, I was chairing the Federal Networking Council Advisory Committee. And I was also part of a World Bank project that actually brought the internet to the People's Republic of China. And in the early 90s, I spent a total of a few months in China. And I took my Macintosh and I made long-distance phone calls running Mac TCP, thinking I was logging into my home computer. And one day I'm sitting in my hotel and I realized, wait a minute, that's not what I'm doing. I'm moving the network to my hotel room in Beijing. I thought, that's interesting. And I came home from that trip, and 2 weeks later I was in Washington at a meeting of the Federal Networking Council Advisory Committee, and Steve Wolf had an agenda item about when are we going to connect the former evil empire and the red Chinese. And I said, excuse me, 2 weeks ago they were on the net.
Other kludgy solutions? But while they're thinking of one, I'll throw another one out. Some of you can remember when the T1 routers showed up on the loading dock. Now, they've been described already. They were a bunch of PCs that were stacked together and put on a token ring, which in today's world sounds pretty reasonable. But remember, when this happened, I was at the University of Nebraska. We just finished putting in a brand new machine room. For a number of political reasons, they didn't have a machine room prior to that. So we had a brand new machine room. And we had all of this wonderful power conditioning equipment and, you know, heavy-duty power supplies and water cooling. And we had one 110-volt outlet in the room. And we had all these machines to plug into it. Now, this is a serious problem because the coffee pot was plugged in there. And so you've got to understand priorities when you're running a 24-hour operation. So the solution was to leave the locked machine room door open and run a bunch of extension cords, which are readily available from Ace Hardware. So we ran extension cords through our new machine room and hooked up the new T1 router. Let me jump to a little more serious question.
That's not a kludge, that's being sensible.
Aren't all kludges? Let me ask a little more serious question. What was the greatest political challenge you faced, and how did you overcome it?
Well, let me go back to the beginning of SURNet. We dealt with what was called the Scientific Council of SURNet, mostly physicists, one per campus, came together and reported back to the campus presidents, and they hadn't seen a network like the SURNet was going to be, and it just took a lot of meetings with them. Someone in the panel said earlier, it's the people problems that are hard, not the hardware problems. And I would say that this was just old-fashioned building relationships and a constituency.
I think that was actually a huge advantage because when the people you're justifying it to didn't understand what you were doing, it was a lot easier.
Yeah, you know, adding on that same theme, I sort of have I found the problem before, or I found the solution before I found the problem, and the fact that we had some money from the National Science Foundation to do this was huge. There were a whole lot of justifications that you didn't have to make because you had the money to do it.
I love to quote Ken King, but his metaphor that running any meetings or discussions with a bunch of CIOs was akin to herding cats is very relevant. I mean, every single one of the NSFNET board meetings, and there were about 4 a year, were examples of huge political problems which had to be solved, but were eventually solved.
Mark, you've been pretty quiet. I can't imagine, as you went through the process of phasing out the ARPANET, that was necessarily met with great enthusiasm by many members of the defense community. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, actually, they were so shocked that I said I was going to do it that by and large, they just remained quiet. If there was a big problem, it was the fact that we had to bridge the culture gap between the defense industrial community and the academic community as represented by NSFNET, and trust that putting our crown jewels of sites, places like MIT, on the net that it was being created by NSF would make it. But again, I had them so shocked that they mostly acquiesced. But then I discovered that MIT, of all places, was in the corner of the country that didn't really quite have the right regional. Okay, it was was on the other side of NSFNET, you may recall, and so had to work with the administration of MIT to sponsor generation of a regional that wasn't an NSFNET regional, but filled that role very quickly. And the long association between BBN and MIT came to our aid there, and BBN took that role on and put up, in fact, a very nice regional that eventually commercialized too.
I'd like to shift gears for just a second. One of the real drivers behind the NSFNET was supercomputing. And, pardon?
Mike Nelson from the floor.
Yes.
I'm going to imagine for a minute that we're in Lower Manhattan rather than in Washington. Ask a couple personal finance questions. You can answer any or all or none of these questions, but I'd be very interested to know if, since you guys were all in on the ground floor, whether you made any particularly good investments, any particularly bad investments, whether there are any investments you wish you had made, and whether you have any hot stock tips for us today.
Buy low, sell high.
Working at a state university, I had gotten very sensitive to this and tried very hard not to do anything financially, personally, that could conflict with my role as basically academic CIO or involvement in SFNET. I was very allergic to it, having participated in a bid for some equipment a few years earlier and being raked over the coals because we ended up buying something from IBM, and I owned 10 shares of IBM at that time. And so I really tried not to. Looking backwards, I see a lot of things I really should have taken the risk.
I think it's remarkable how uniform that attitude was held throughout the community. And I've had lots of reason to reflect on it myself, having not made any great investments. The rewards for being at a university include freedom to do research, interacting with the students, working on interesting technical problems, and so on. And a lot of us who are involved but not necessarily doing the deep technical work, we're not getting those rewards. And yet we're at universities getting compensated at university levels instead of private sector levels. And I think a lot of people should be credited with sticking with it rather than leaving to go get those rewards to make it all happen. And I don't put myself necessarily in that category, but I know that there are many other people in this room, and I point out again that Dennis and Steve were working for the federal government, not for personal reward, but did all of the good stuff that they did without the possibility, at least until leaving the government, of any major reward from it, and care to not create the conflicts.
I agree with those comments, and I would add that at the time that we were selecting the routers for SFNET, there was a notion that there was this thing called a sun that had appeared on the West Coast, and I got some contact information for Sun and called them up, and they said, so who are you and where are you from? And eventually decided that the East Coast was too far away from their support network to provide support for, so they wouldn't sell us anything.
Other questions from the audience?
I feel a little bit better because on the Hill and at the White House, I wasn't going to invest in any of these companies either, but I'm glad I'm not the only one who missed the boat.
As I look back on life, I have two places where I have regrets. One was 1975. I was teaching a graduate course, and I had all the students build a microcomputer when they first came into class. That was the first thing they did because we had to have our own computer to write an operating system, so we'd build a computer. That was a couple years before the Apple I. I've wondered about my thinking and sensibility at the time, and I just concluded it was simply, you know, I was young and dumb. some years later, I had an opportunity to buy one of the mid-level networks for $180,000, and I didn't. So I guess my only excuse at that point is that I was old and dumb. So I guess that's the best answer. I haven't see someone out there. The lights shine on the stage, so it's very hard to see folks in the audience.
Thank you. Dennis Jennings here. I'd like to ask a sort of question about motivation. When we in the National Science Foundation devised the three-layer model, and through the responsibility for funding campus networks on the campuses, and only very small funding for the regional networks, the motivation was to leverage to get other funds, state funds, campus funds, and so on, because we couldn't afford it. But nevertheless, I'm astonished by the level of enthusiasm and commitment and acceptance of partially funded things that were by the community, by the regionals, by the campuses, and the number of people that rode in behind this to create campus and regional networks. I don't really understand it, and I'd like your thoughts on what motivated people to buy into this vision of the national network. Thank you.
One of the things that partial funding did was to enable other funding to happen. To have a stamp that said the NSF has approved your proposal and thinks it's worthwhile was worth more than the money that was actually there. And so other people on campus who were getting grants from other agencies could go and say, I need to put some money in my proposal to fund my part of the connection to the network so that I can go and participate in this. And since both sides could point to matching funding, it looked like a great deal from both points of view. And I have to say that happened over and over again with state money, with campus money, with researcher money. And that is one of the reasons that the partial funding actually worked, is it enabled this kind of, look, somebody else is contributing, now it's safe for you to do so also.
Additionally, the timing was very good. There were a number of predecessor networks, UUCP, BitNet. The SURNet proposal was developed by collaboration over BitNet. The SURNet site in North Carolina was in the same machine room where the BitNet node was. So the infrastructure people saw this as a logical progression and were able to afford it on the margin rather than fully funding it. If someone would buy them the routers and the pay for the lines, then they could have 7x24 operation at very little extra cost, and they were anxious to move in that direction.
I'll tell you what got my juices flowing and why a big part of why I think it was successful and why we were able to get so much leverage out of so little money was it was just a great idea. This concept of packet switching and a common protocol, I think, could really open up the imagination of what could be. I don't, at least for my part, I couldn't extend that out to being as far as what the internet is today, but just imagining what we might be able to do with something like that for me was fascinating and was part of my pitch as I went around.
It was a real network effect.
Yeah.
I think Dennis won't be surprised to hear me argue with his premise. I think none of us, particularly those who had a budget, were enthused about having to go find more money. What we're enthused about, as Jim points out, is the enterprise. We wanted to do it, and NSF only supplied some of the resources, so we went and found other resources. But it wasn't because we thought going and finding resources was lots of fun. It was an important enterprise. It was an exciting enterprise. It was changing the way things were going on. And Doug said started to say something about the supercomputer centers. The same thing was going on in supercomputing at the time. It was the advent of computational simulation as another way of doing science that was just emerging from the weapons labs into the rest of physics and chemistry and later biology that was going on, and everybody involved was very excited about doing that. No one was excited about writing proposals and selling shares to industry and so on. That was just a necessary, dirty job that had to be done in order to do the good work.
I've always argued that it was an idea whose time had come. And in fact, I don't believe that if the internet hadn't come about the way it did, it would have come about some other way in a similar technology. I think the way it came about is something we're all very proud of. But it was the technology was ripe for it in communications and computing. The existence proofs were there in the ARPANET and other networks, and it was an idea whose time had come. So you had like a supersaturated solution where you drop in a crystal and things happen.
Just one minor point. I think a lot of us looked at the numbers and what it would have taken for NSF to actually fund the whole enterprise and realized that it was just beyond what one could possibly expect. And as a result, that was also that, I mean, Sid is 100% right. Nobody enjoyed going out, begging for money, but I think there was the realization that it wasn't an unreasonable thing for NSF to ask, given the reality of the situation and the total resources needed.
If, amplifying on what we've otherwise heard, think about what the competition was at the time. SNA, could you argue that? And by the way, IBM was already bought into this, right? Two, ISDN. There was certainly a quarter that said, well, you can do all of this with ISDN. And so, we had some models to compare TCP, IP, and internetworking with.
The partial funding also really helped speed commercialization, I think, of the network. Because when someone approached Surinat and said, we'll pay for a connection, the answer was immediately, gee, if you'll pay for your whole connection, absolutely, we'll take that money because we need it so badly because we were only partially funded. So I think it was also a spur to getting more commercial organizations on the network sooner.
Yeah, that same phenomenon happened in the beginning of the supercomputer centers themselves. And John Conway and I spent a lot of time arguing over the budget after the award was made. And one of the things I negotiated was, if you want me to go get extra money from somebody, I have to be able to deliver something. And I negotiated something that became, or John and I negotiated something that became a tenet of the centers, that 10% of the resources were available for industrial purposes. And that was how we agreed to find the additional funds elsewhere.
Well, I would like to thank our panelists, and we're going to end on time and on budget. Thank you.